Execute. Exeggcute. Exeggcute. Execute. Yeah, I'm just gonna go with execute. Pokemon that are natural-born culminations of multiple individuals are fascinating studies. These creatures that are born as multiple sets of individuals all function as one individual creature. And the thing is that these Pokemon often have to be evolved into, such as Dugtrio, Magneton, or Zweilous and Hydreigon. It's actually incredibly rare for a Pokemon's base evolutionary stage to be composed of multiple individuals, such as today's Pokemon, the Exeggcute line. Hello everyone, and welcome to the Pokemon Care Guides, where we go through how you would raise and care for different Pokemon species in your own home. Today, we'll be talking about the multi-egg, seed, head Pokemon, Exeggcute, and its palm tree-esque evolution, Exeggutor. Exeggcute is a collection of 6 light pink eggs with small faces on each of them. Except that's a lie and a common misconception. They're actually all closer to plant seeds than eggs, despite their egg-like shell and liquidy insides. After all, they are grass types as well as psychic types, so it makes sense that they would have some plant biology to them. And that's really it for the first evolution. It's fairly small, only standing about 1 foot 4 inches tall, or 0.4 meters, and weighing in about 5.5 pounds, or 2.5 kilograms. And that's for the entirety of the 6 eggs. That's not each egg individually. But when exposed to the energies of a leaf stone, your Exeggcute will evolve into an Exeggutor, a Pokemon that has a body like a palm tree, complete with brown bark-like body, and green fronds sticking out of its... I think it would be called its torso? Or maybe it's out of its head? To be honest, I'm not really sure. The biology of these guys is really weird. It has no arms, but it does have 2 legs with 2 spiky toes on each foot. Lastly, the 6 separate seeds now have merged and become 3 separate heads, looking like 3 coconuts with derpy faces on them. I should also mention that Exeggutor is a very big Pokemon. They stand 6.5 feet tall, 2 meters, and weigh 264 pounds, or 120 kilos. That's bigger than the average person. That's bigger than me. I should add that we won't be covering the Alolan version of this Pokemon in this guide. Even though they may seem similar in appearance, the Alolan Exeggutor has different needs and behaves very differently than its mainland counterpart. We'll be covering that much later on when we get to the Alola region, very far in the future. In all, this is a very strange Pokemon line, and if that happens to catch your interest, then let's get into it and find out if these guys are the perfect Pokemon partners for you. Enclosure. In all honesty, the enclosure for this Pokemon is very confusing to make. In plenty of spots in the wild, they appear where the area is warm, where there's water nearby, there's sandy soil, and plenty of trees. But they also appear in places where the weather gets cold, there isn't any water, and the ground not only isn't sandy, but it's hard-packed and full of roots. It's very strange, almost like the Sandshrew line, where they've been transplanted into these areas where they can survive, but not thrive. As far as I can tell, the best environment for these guys is the first kind that I mentioned, the warm, sandy, wet environment. So that's what I'm going to tell you about for the enclosure. Let's start with the easy part. These Pokemon do best when kept in a consistent, warm climate. These Pokemon are vulnerable to the ice type, yes, but their bodies also can't take any kind of frost. Any form of long-term exposure to it can cause damage to their cells and hurt their ability to photosynthesize, which, I'm sure you can guess, is a major part of how they survive. This means you want to keep them somewhere warm, meaning somewhere between 60 to 80 degrees Fahrenheit, which is about 15 to 26 degrees Celsius. If you live somewhere where the temperatures are in or near that range all year round, then you can realistically keep these Pokemon outside as long as you have the right soil. However, if you live in a place like Sinnoh or Unova where winter is pretty prominent when it rolls around, then you'll have to build them their own fully enclosed enclosure. You're looking at something that's akin to a greenhouse, something that can keep heat inside and will have a heater running 24/7. This means that the walls and ceiling will need to be made of glass or opaque plastic. I recommend the plastic more as it's a better insulator, but the glass isn't that much worse and it does provide you with a cool view of your Pokemon's enclosure. You will, of course, also need a heating system that'll be able to handle keeping the room at that temperature, all the while not drying the air out and being able to handle some humidity. Aside from all that, the structure of the building isn't that complex, only requiring a door set into the side of it to allow you access into the enclosure. Whether you're housing your Exeggcute evolution in an enclosure or you're able to have them out in the open, there are still a few things to consider. One is space. Exeggcute will not need that much given its smaller size and relatively sedentary nature. Exeggcute itself will only need about a 30-foot by 30-foot space, or 9 meters by 9 meters, though not all of that will be usable by the Pokemon. Some of it will be taken up by other features of the environment such as the water feature or plant coverage, both of which we'll cover in a second. But as for Exeggutor, they are, of course, much larger. And while they're still considered a sedentary Pokemon, they are able to move around much easier than Exeggcute. So for them, you'll have to increase the size of the enclosure to a 100-foot by 100-foot square of ground, which comes out to be about 30.5 meters on both sides. This is still not that big of a section of ground, while being big enough for the Pokemon to get up and stretch its legs if it really wants to. Which brings me to the second thing you'll have to do with the enclosure for these guys. You're probably going to have to terraform your enclosure. These Pokemon need a body of water that's nearby to them, and they need soil that's a combination of sand and firm soil. So here's what we're going to do. Somewhere in your enclosure, you'll have to set up a water feature. It doesn't have to be deep, just deep enough and large enough that an Exeggutor could walk into it and submerge itself up to about its waist, like the shallow end of a pool. The water feature could be anywhere, from in the corner of your enclosure or along one of the walls, or even situated in the center. It doesn't matter so long as it's there. This will fulfill multiple functions as your Pokemon's water source. It'll help to saturate and dampen the surrounding soil for your Pokemon, and it should raise the surrounding humidity of the air by at least a small amount. As for the soil, you want it to be far more sandy in and surrounding the water. With it slowly transitioning into more regular soil the farther away from the water you get. This combination of sandy and firm soil will allow it to hold some water while also providing great drainage. This means that the ground will be damp, just like it would be in a jungle, but the sand will make sure that you don't end up with puddles of stagnant water around thanks to the drainage. As well, the bottom of the water feature should be a gentle slope downward to allow your Pokemon to enter the water without falling in pretty much. You especially want to avoid that with Exeggcute, as they can't really swim their way out of deep water, and if you're not around to help them out, then it could not end well. Also, be sure to add some sort of filtration system to your water feature, something that'll not only stir up the water so it doesn't become stagnant, but will also help to clean the water. It shouldn't get too messy since these Pokemon aren't known for swimming in their water, but having anything that'll help it to keep it that way will be a big help. The last part of this enclosure that you'll need decoration-wise is the foliage. Granted, this is more important to have for Exeggcute as opposed to Exeggutor, but it will help to make the second evolution more comfortable. In the wild, Exeggcutes are a very common prey for flying-type Pokemon. Sure, if they're able to see the threat coming and have enough time to react, then they have the chance to drive the predator off with their psychic powers. But they don't always see them coming. And even if they do, the flying type might be strong enough to push through and still get at the Exeggcute. To that end, Exeggcute spends a lot of its time hiding under the foliage along the ground, using it as cover from prying eyes in the sky. Because they evolved to do this instinctively, only emerging when necessary, if they end up spending a prolonged time in a space where they don't have that cover, it could end up causing them undue amounts of stress. The Pokemon will feel exposed, in danger, and always on edge. Even if you're keeping your Pokemon in the greenhouse setup I detailed earlier, they're still going to get stressed out if you don't give them the foliage they need to hide. This stress could easily lead to your Pokemon becoming overly anxious, it could lead to them becoming sick and needing to go to the Pokemon Center, or it could even lead to them thinking that you're a threat in that situation and staying away from you whenever you enter the enclosure, which I'm assuming you don't want. Your best bet when looking for plants to use are large, wide-leaf plants that stay close to the ground, like ferns. This will give them cover from the sky while also leaving the ground clear enough for an Exeggcute to move around. When it comes to the evolved form, like I said, Exeggutor doesn't need the foliage as much as its pre-evolution did. It's large enough and strong enough now that any flying-type Pokemon that comes after it, even the larger ones, are going to be wary of taking it on. Even still, it does prefer to be near a few plants that it can use to blend in with. After all, it does mimic a palm tree, so that it can use those plants to blend into its environment. Eventually, when and if you expose your Pokemon to a leaf stone, it might be best to take out some of the ferns and replace them with a few palm trees, just to help your Pokemon feel slightly safer in its environment. When it comes to Pokemon that can be housed with your Exeggcute evolution, you definitely want to avoid fire types of all kinds, especially the ones that have open flames or excessive heat coming off their bodies at all times. With how this enclosure is built, you'll either end up with them accidentally burning down the foliage side of the enclosure, or they'll end up having issues with the water and the humidity. As well, anything that is overly predatory is a no-go. Exeggcute make great prey for anything larger than a Growlithe, so putting them together in a confined space is not a good idea. That's not so much a concern for Exeggutor as it is for Exeggcute, but I would still avoid anything that might try to take a bite out of them. Like I said, an Exeggutor, they're fairly strong, and even if they don't end up getting hurt themselves, it might still end up hurting the other Pokemon in retaliation or self-defense. Your best bet here is to add in other grass-type Pokemon, particularly the ones that can handle a warm environment like the one we built for Exeggcute. Bellossom would be a perfect companion for the Exeggcute line, and the Tangela, Cherubi, and Bellsprout lines would all also be decent additions. You can make a decent tropical arboretum out of those species alone, and I should say that these Pokemon do well together with others of their own kind, to an extent. There can be some issues with singular individuals from Exeggcute clutches getting swapped around or causing imbalances among the clutches, but that's more something that we'll cover in the care section of the guide. For now, just know that these Pokemon can be housed with others of their own evolutionary line, so long as you give them the space to tolerate one another. Always remember that the specifications that I give you in these guides are only built for one member of the topic species, and if you want to get more or expand the number of species you'll be housing with them, you'll need to expand the enclosure to accommodate them. Availability. For most regions, these Pokemon are only available where they've been imported and stocked. Which makes sense when you think about it. These Pokemon are very clearly built for warm weather and tropical environments, not the cooler environments of many of the other regions. Dan was actually telling me about a theory that he has about this, about how the Alolan Exeggutor is actually the original version of the Pokemon, and after being brought to the other regions, it adapted to be shorter to conserve energy and nutrition, and thus adapted to the Psychic type as it didn't have the needed energy resources to power its Dragon-type abilities. This can even be corroborated by Alolan natives saying that the Alolan version is how the Pokemon is supposed to be like, and why you most often encounter these Pokemon in artificial environments in other regions. This includes places like the Great Marsh here in Sinnoh, or Blueberry Academy in Unova. They were in the old Kanto Safari Zone before it got moved over to the Johto region, where they're not currently stocked, though that's because they're actually very common in the Johto region. Almost every tree on nearly every route, from Route 28 through 48, has a chance of having these Pokemon sheltering near its roots, as well as a fair number of the cities. Mainland Unova used to have scattered reports of Exeggcute and Exeggutor appearing on Route 18, but they unfortunately haven't been sighted in quite a while, so it's assumed the population there isn't there anymore. Either moved on or died out, unfortunately. Best guess is that this population is from escaped imports from some smuggling operation back when Unova was still closed to foreign imports, and their numbers were just too low to sustain a wild population. As for Kalos, they have a small wild population that exists surrounding Azure Bay and the nearby Route 12, of course, near the water. And of course, you can find these Pokemon in Alola, but we'll cover them later on when we get to the Alolan section of the Pokedex. But when it comes to the Galar, Hoenn, and Paldea regions, they don't have a native population of these Pokemon. So if you decide you want one, you'll either have to go somewhere else to get one, or you'll have to look to the breeding scene. And I should also mention that it's much rarer to find an Exeggutor in the wild as opposed to an Exeggcute. The likelihood of these Pokemon finding a Leaf Stone in the wild is not that high, despite the fact that the Leaf Stones are the most common stones to form. If you are planning on finding an Exeggutor out there, then you may be looking for quite some time. Going back to the breeding scene, it's not terrible, but they also aren't that common out there for people to raise. They're more popular for people who want to have something along the lines of the Arboretum idea I mentioned in the Enclosure section, or trainers who want an easy-to-care for Psychic type that they can add to their teams. For the average person like you and I, there isn't too much demand for these Pokemon. Combine that with the fact that Exeggcute is multiple individuals that come together to form one entity, and you're basically caring for 6 Pokemon for every one you can sell. So, if you want an Exeggcute, then you may have a harder time finding a breeder for it than if you were looking for a more conventional grass type. And it may cost more as well, since they're probably going to pass on the cost of feeding all 6 individuals to you. Thankfully, they evolved with one of the easier to acquire stones, so if you manage to find someone that's selling an Exeggcute, then I'm sure they wouldn't have any issue evolving it before selling it to you. Though, keep in mind, the price is going to go up thanks to the price of the stone. Catchability. If you decide to go after one of these Pokemon in the wild, then there are a few things that you have to keep in mind when you do so. First is to make sure that you have the entire thing. As we'll cover more in depth in the care section of the guide, I promise I'm not going to keep saying that, Exeggcute can sometimes get split up, leading to one clutch actually having less than 6 individuals. This is an issue for the Pokemon, as it can lead to a lot of stress and anxiety as it searches for the lost member, and it also leads to its psychic abilities being on the fritz and less reliable, meaning they're more vulnerable to predation. If the missing member is far enough away from the group, then it can lead to not being caught alongside its siblings, and therefore you have permanently locked it into a state of panic and stress, which I'm sure we can all agree is a terrible fate to have. Aside from that possibility, you also have to be careful when it comes to those psychic abilities. Thankfully, Exeggute's abilities aren't the kind that lead to physical manipulation like with the Aber line, but more of the mental and emotional manipulation, kind of like the Drowsy line. Their psychic abilities are more for linking together the members of their clutch or the different heads of an Exeggutor. They also use them to scan their environments and can tell through the detection of emotions of the creatures around them what is nearby and what their intentions are. This is how they can tell when a predator is hunting them and when it's best to hide away. It's only when running or hiding is not an option that these Pokemon actually turn to attack and defend themselves. Your best bet when hunting down one of these Pokemon is to try to spot them from a distance and then move quick and fast. If you move fast enough before they can react, then you may be able to catch them before they can sense your presence. Funny enough, this propensity for running instead of fighting is the exact reason they get stalked in places like the Great Marsh and the old Safari Zone. There was very little risk to someone who wasn't being a complete idiot around the Pokemon. Then again, they did stock Pokemon like Rhyhorn, Carnivine, and Skorupi, so maybe the people running those places weren't that concerned with safety after all. Anyway, if you decide you want to hunt for an Exeggutor, then it'll be easier to spot and track than their pre-evolutions, but again, they're stronger. If they turn to fight, then you'll have a harder battle on your hands. Of course, if you decide you want to get one of these Pokemon outside of a Safari Zone, then you should also be equipped with a Pokemon of your own to protect you in the off chance these Pokemon do turn to fight. Your best bets are Fire types or Dark types, as they'll be best able to shrug off any blows these Pokemon throw at them. Funny enough, I guess that makes my very own Booster the perfect Pokemon for hunting these guys down. Cool. If you do manage to get the drop on them, then I'd say your best bet is using a Quick Ball. But if that fails and you have to use something else after the Pokemon's guard is up, then a Great Ball will be best for Exeggcute and an Ultra Ball for an Exeggutor. Care. And now we finally circle back to a few things that I mentioned before in the guide, like the food situation for these guys. Thanks to their partial grass typing, they're able to photosynthesize like many of the grass types we've talked about before. You just have to make sure they have ready access to sunlight and can rest there for a while. This has a nice benefit of cutting the amount of food you have to give them over the course of a day. As for what you actually have to feed them, it's going to change based on what evolution stage you're talking about. With Exeggcute, their whole goal is to build up enough nutrients to be able to evolve. And to that end, they mainly consume nutrient-rich soil. Yeah, Exeggcute eats dirt. Now, you can of course allow them to eat chunks out of the enclosure, certainly, but that also comes with a few issues. One is that the soil may not be the best, especially if you have real plants growing in the enclosure. Those plants are going to be pulling nutrients out of the soil, so in reality, the very plants that you planted to help your Pokemon feel safe are going to be competing with them. Also, it's really going to get annoying to constantly find and fill in all the holes that your Pokemon is going to be making by eating small bits and pieces here and there. To combat these issues, it would be best if you feed Exeggcute some separate soil in a dish. By doing this, you can not only be sure that the soil is going to be full of good nutrients for your Pokemon, but you can also train your Pokemon to always come to one spot to feed. That way they aren't snacking and leaving small holes all throughout your enclosure. Just be sure that the dish is big enough for all the members of the Pokemon to be able to eat at once. They can get kinda cranky if some of them are eating and the rest don't get any food. Finding some good soil for these guys also won't be too hard to do. You can buy massive bags of the stuff from any hardware store. Remember that you want to buy soil that is rated for tropical plants, as that'll be the best for an Exeggcute. When looking at its evolution Exeggutor, then things change a bit. Exeggutor isn't storing up nutrients for an evolution anymore, so it doesn't need to eat the soil. Not to mention that the Exeggutor doesn't have arms or even a neck, so you can't really bend down to eat soil without face planting. Instead, they've evolved to eat low-hanging fruits from different trees. This means that you'll have to be replacing the soil with things like sliced bananas, sliced mangoes, and other tropical citrus fruits. And again, since they don't really have a neck and can't bend down too far, you'll have to feed them on a raised platform, where their heads are able to easily reach. Thankfully, since the Pokemon now share a body, the different heads aren't going to get upset if only one of them can get to the food, so you don't have to do anything special for that here. It's not as easy as just feeding them dirt, but it's also still not too bad. As for the amounts you should be giving them, Exeggcute should always have some soil ready for it throughout the day. It's really hard to nail down exact numbers when we're talking about the first stage, as with 6 individuals all eating throughout the day, it's gonna vary greatly. The best advice that I found online is to make sure that the food is topped off every morning and night, and they should be good with that. Exeggutor, however, now that's just one individual. It's much easier to track. You'll be feeding your Exeggutor twice a day, morning and night, and giving them about 2 pounds of fruit per feeding. That may seem low for a Pokemon of this size, but remember, they are very sedentary, so they aren't spending that much energy just moving around, and they also get a good amount of nutrition through photosynthesis. One thing that we haven't talked about very much in this guide is the psychic side of these Pokemon. Like I mentioned in the catchability section of the guide, these Pokemon use their psychic abilities to mainly sense the other individuals and any other creatures that are around them. While this is a main defense mechanism for them, it can also be used to help them get used to you being around. Especially with Exeggcute, these Pokemon are going to be very wary of you being near them. They aren't a very social species outside of their own cluster. But so long as you're patient, friendly, and have positive intentions toward them, they will eventually get used to you being around them and even come up to you when you enter their enclosure. Start off by just existing in the same space as them, showing them you can just be around and you aren't going to hurt them. Then, as they start getting used to your presence, start to actually interact with them. This can start with you talking to it in a very friendly and soft manner, or if your Pokemon does get used to you enough, even try some hand feeding. Unfortunately, you'll never reach the point where you can cuddle them or pick them up without them freaking out, but you can get to the point where they can enjoy your company and hang out with you inside their enclosure. I should also mention that this will be a much easier thing to do with Exeggutor as opposed to Exeggcute. The later evolution is just a much more laid-back personality and less anxious about predators overall. Before we move on to the cost section of the guide, I do want to talk about a few biological quirks that these Pokemon have. One is the cracks that frequently appear on Exeggcute as they grow in age. There's a myth out there that says that Exeggcute gets cracks as they grow, and when they have a bunch of cracks all over them, that means they're ready to evolve. This isn't true. One, these Pokemon evolve through stone evolution, so there are plenty of Exeggcute all over the world that never find a stone and therefore never evolve. There simply isn't a ready-to-evolve state for these Pokemon. Instead, the cracks are made from either the Pokemon growing, and therefore having to break or crack its outer shell to make room for the newer one underneath, or it's a result of damage. If you happen to find that one of your Exeggcute members has a crack in it, then keep an eye on it and watch and see if it cracks through its older shell and has a newer one underneath. It shouldn't take longer than a couple days, a week at most, for this to happen. If, after that week, the Pokemon is still cracked, then it's most likely from damage, and at that point, I would take it to the Pokemon Center to get checked out. It may be nothing and will most likely vanish with the next shedding, but it's always best to be sure. Another thing to keep an eye on is Exeggutor's heads. I haven't mentioned this before, but while its heads do communicate with each other with their psychic abilities, they are still each an individual head. And when the Pokemon gets excited, they all try to scream or talk at the same time. So if your Pokemon starts to make a ton of noise, then don't worry about it too much. No, what might cause you to worry is if one of your Pokemon's heads falls off. Yeah, their heads can just fall off and fall to the ground, it's nuts. This mainly happens as the Pokemon ages. One of the heads may end up getting too large or too heavy for the body to sustain, and the head will just fall off. Fear not, they aren't dead, but these heads are in fact an auxiliary form of reproduction, though not a very effective one. Over the course of a couple of days, the dropped head will revert back into an individual Exeggcute, while a brand new head will begin to grow in the place the old one used to occupy. If this happens, you don't have to worry so much about the Exeggutor, just increase its food intake for a couple of days so it has the needed nutrition to regrow the head. No, what you have to worry about is the newly formed Exeggcute. It's gonna be without a clutch of its own. This Pokemon is gonna be going through a high amount of stress and anxiety. The best solution for this is to collect the Pokemon immediately and bring it to your local Pokemon Center. From there, they can take the Pokemon and get it either to a Pokemon Ranger who has the resources to reunite it with others of its kind, or to a Pokemon Rescue Center that may have a clutch that's missing a member already. Cost. Depending on if you have to build the fully enclosed enclosure or you live in a tropical climate, then this can either be at the lower end of the cost scale or the upper end. Then you also have to factor in the water feature you'll probably need to install, all the foliage and plants you'll have to plant, and even the need to redo the soil if you don't have the right mixture, and you're probably going to be looking at the high end of the moderate category or the very high category if you need to build the building as well. While the Pokemon itself isn't rare or hard to find, it's also not the easiest. Thanks to the relative unpopularity of these Pokemon when compared to other psychic types, there isn't that big a market for them. Combine that with the fact that there are sometimes literal simulated and curated parks where you can go to catch one of these Pokemon, and there aren't that many people out there that sell them. In reality, if you can get in touch with a breeder for these Pokemon, then I wouldn't think they would charge you more than the moderate category, and that's for both evolutionary stages. I don't see the Leaf Stone bringing this price up too much. Food is a place where you're going to get off easy. Like I said, for Exeggcute, you can easily get a large bag of soil for very cheap from most hardware stores. And even if you decide to evolve your Pokemon into an Exeggutor, the amount of fruit you're looking at shouldn't cost you much more than the low or possibly the moderate category, depending on how much fruit is near you. Conclusion. Really, these Pokemon aren't that bad. They have some quirks to them that mostly extend from their unusual biology, but when you look at their care as a whole, I think they would make a decent intermediate Pokemon. Non-aggressive, easy to care for, and really the only sticking point that's keeping me from saying that they're a good Pokemon for beginners is the fact that they need that tropical environment, which is a lot for a beginner to sink into. But if you're looking for an interesting Pokemon that not many people are going to have, and won't take up your entire life just to care for them, then this might just be the perfect Pokemon partner for you. Thank you all for listening, and please join us again next time when we talk about the commonly misunderstood Pokemon Cubone and its evolution Marowak. Have a wonderful night, everyone.